A physical structure refuses thermal saturation, not through mechanical refrigeration. Through direct energy absorption within the drywall, solar radiation strikes the exterior. The interior climate remains completely static. The ambient temperature halts. The physical agent is salt, a basic, inexpensive sodium compound. It possesses a fixed thermodynamic threshold. It absorbs massive thermal loads at a singular geometric state. Humans constructed these specific dwellings decades ago. The physics functioned perfectly. Then the structures vanished. Total erasure from municipal zoning. How does a sodium compound arrest thermal transfer? Why did centralized energy providers ensure this physical mechanism remained absent from public application? The resistance of external heat predates the air conditioner by millennia. To comprehend the sodium architecture, you must observe the basal physics it weaponizes. Enter a mud brick structure in an arid biome. Enter a thick stone dwelling in a Mediterranean climate at peak solar intensity. A distinct physical reality occurs. The internal air is cool. It lacks mechanical freezing. It lacks forced air. It maintains a low thermal index against external bombardment. No compressor operates here. The structure executes the regulation. The physics is thermal mass. Dense atomic structures resist temperature shifts. Stone, packed earth, brick. They demand massive kinetic energy to alter their state. Solar radiation bombards a 2-foot stone barrier. The mass intercepts the heat flux. The kinetic energy embeds in the atomic lattice. The energy does not penetrate to the interior. The air inside stays static. The wall sustains the thermal load. The planet rotates. Atmospheric temperatures drop. The wall discharges the stored thermal radiation back into the vacuum of the night. The atomic lattice resets. The cycle prepares to repeat. Structural engineers label this chronological delay thermal lag. This is the physical reality of the masonry. It dictates the entire mechanical sequence. This is categorized as a cooling agent. It is not a cooling agent. It is the forced stabilization of an environment. It destroys the thermal variance. It flattens the amplitude between solar peak and nocturnal drop. It constructs a static baseline. A massive stone does not chill a corridor. It simply denies the transfer of kinetic energy. Human populations endured arid biomes for thousands of years without electrical grids. The architecture regulated the thermodynamics, but this mechanical strategy dictates an absolute physical penalty. A penalty the sodium compound eliminates. To enforce thermal lag through density, you require staggering volume. Walls spanning 36 inches. Metric tons of atomic weight. The physics succeed. The construction fails. It is heavy. It is slow. It consumes gross square footage. It requires massive capital. For millennia, this was the mandatory physical toll for thermal stability. Then a specific material was weaponized. A material executing the exact thermodynamic suppression with a fraction of the atomic volume. The material is a sodium compound. To comprehend its mechanical superiority, observe the deviation from standard masonry. Dense stone stores kinetic energy through standard specific heat capacity. It absorbs radiation. Its physical temperature elevates incrementally. Apply more energy. The stone gets hotter. That is the sole physical mechanism of density. It mandates extreme volume. The sodium compound executes a different equation. The compound, configured correctly, absorbs a violent thermal load without raising its internal temperature by a single fraction. The exact chemical configuration is a salt hydrate. The most prevalent variant is sodium sulfate, colloquially labeled Glauber's salt. It costs pennies. It poses zero biological threat. It cannot combust. It harbors a physical capacity absent in standard stone. It forces a thermal anomaly. Physicists define it as a phase change material. This is the core thermodynamic mechanism. The compound absorbs ambient energy. It hits a precise thermal threshold. The molecular lattice destabilizes. It transitions from a solid state to a liquid state. During this structural collapse, it consumes massive thermal energy. Its baseline temperature does not move. The external heat flux fuels the molecular phase change. The kinetic energy severs the atomic bonds. It does not elevate the baseline temperature. The compound remains completely static. It absorbs the thermal load. The temperature locks in place. The planet rotates. Ambient room temperature drops. The compound reverses the phase change. The liquid solidifies. It ejects the stored thermal radiation back into the physical space. The molecular structure resets for the following solar cycle. Observe the implications for structural architecture. A thin geometric plane of this sodium compound intercepts identical thermal loads to a massive block of industrial concrete. It skips baseline warming. It leverages phase destabilization. It delivers thermal mass without the physical tonnage. The general population operates under a false assumption. The complete thermodynamic data regarding sodium cooling protocols is archived below. Access the index. Extract the manual. It transfers immediately. This is not theoretical physics awaiting discovery. Residential structures integrated phase change architecture in the 1940s. The deployment surged again during the solar acquisition era of the 1970s and 1980s. Biological subjects inhabited them. The physics functioned perfectly. Then the structures were systematically erased. To comprehend the efficiency of the sodium compound, you must observe the mechanics of the phase change. To comprehend how a chemical plane arrests a thermal climb, you must differentiate between two distinct thermodynamic classifications. It is the absolute foundation of the mechanism. The first classification is kinetic energy registering on standard mercury instrumentation. Thermal engineers designate this sensible heat. You apply thermal radiation to a vessel of water. Every joule of added energy elevates the physical temperature. The data climbs on the gauge. That is sensible heat. It is the sole mechanism accessible to standard masonry. Apply energy. The temperature escalates. It is a linear equation. The second classification appears to violate standard thermodynamic law. You have observed it repeatedly without comprehension. Observe a cylinder of water containing solid ice. The solid mass destabilizes. It melts. The physical anomaly occurs here. While the solid mass exists, the liquid remains locked at exactly 32 degrees Fahrenheit. You can subject the vessel to a high-temperature environment. You can bombard it with thermal radiation for 60 minutes. The internal temperature will not exceed the freezing threshold until the final solid structure collapses. The incoming thermal radiation is not elevating the baseline temperature. It is consumed entirely by the mechanical act of structural destabilization. Physicists classify this as latent heat. It is the invisible energy absorbed during a phase transition. This is the exact mechanism of the salt hydrate, but it executes the phase transition at an optimal biological baseline. The compound is chemically calibrated to destabilize at approximately 77 degrees Fahrenheit. Solar radiation intensifies. The interior climate approaches the threshold. The sodium compound registers the exact transition temperature. It arrests the thermal climb instantly. Instead of allowing ambient escalation, the compound destabilizes. It locks the baseline temperature in place. It consumes the incoming heat flux to fuel the phase change. It denies the warming of the oxygen. The interior environment hits the optimal threshold. It remains entirely static. It is pinned by the melting salt. The thermal radiation that would normally bake the interior vanishes into the atomic separation. Atmospheric temperature drops. The compound solidifies. It ejects the stored radiation. It resets for the subsequent solar cycle. The physics are absolute. The remaining variable is absolute thermal capacity. This is the metric that dictates reality. Sodium sulfate decahydrate transitions at 32 degrees Celsius. During this transition, it consumes exactly 241 kilojoules of thermal energy per kilogram of mass. That singular metric is the entire foundation. Observe the physical translation. Kilogram for kilogram. Within optimal biological parameters, the chemical compound stores exponentially more thermal radiation than industrial concrete. Concrete requires incremental temperature escalation to store energy. The sodium compound consumes massive thermal loads at a static temperature during phase transition. The practical result is devastating to standard construction protocols. This is not theoretical modeling. It is physical reality. It is quantified. On a community college campus in Asheville, North Carolina, structural technicians installed 274 pipes. The payload was 1,370 pounds of phase-change sodium. They utilized a standard fan to force oxygen across the surface area. That localized installation delivers exactly 30 kilowatt hours of thermal storage capacity. It intercepts solar radiation during peak hours. It discharges the energy during the nocturnal drop. A plastic tube, a Standardfan, a pile of salt. The architecture achieves complete thermodynamic stability. Biological subjects have inhabited this thermal anomaly. During the solar integration testing of the 1980s, sodium matrices were embedded in residential structures. The human occupants documented the physical reality, a dwelling that maintained absolute climate stasis. Without mechanical combustion, without a centralized compressor operating, the structure self-regulated. This is not fringe experimentation. The United States Department of Energy is actively funding research protocols today. They are analyzing salt hydrates embedded directly into standard drywall constraints. The objective is exact. The materials store and discharge kinetic energy as a latent phase transition. It violently reduces the electrical load required for mechanical climate control. Absolute physical honesty is required. Magic does not exist. This chemical matrix does not refrigerate a physical space. It stabilizes it. It arrests the thermal index at optimal biological levels. It refuses to permit upward temperature escalation. Executed correctly, this thermodynamic suppression is the entire objective. The metrics are indisputable. The field tests are absolute. This forces a logical paradox. If phase change barriers achieve this efficiency, why is planetary architecture devoid of them? The data regarding non-mechanical thermal suppression is compiled. It is titled the Free Cooling Manual. 3 text files. The exact physics of sodium phase change. 60 localized methods excluded from public knowledge. The Structural Construction Manual. 86 physical protocols. Verified metrics. 0 mechanical accessories. It carries a 7-day financial guarantee. The access index is below. Maintain your attention. The historical burial of this architecture dictates a severe biological response. This is the structural reality withheld by corporate retailers. Sodium phase change barriers function perfectly, but they present specific mechanical failures. You must comprehend the physics of these failures. The primary failure is a thermodynamic anomaly called supercooling. In a theoretical model, the compound destabilizes during heating and solidifies during cooling at the identical thermal threshold. Physical reality deviates. Occasionally, during the nocturnal temperature drop, the salt bypasses its freezing point. It remains entirely liquid. It refuses molecular reassembly. If the atomic lattice does not solidify, the stored radiation is not ejected. The matrix does not reset. The subsequent solar cycle is undefended. The mechanical correction is a nucleating agent, a microscopic physical seed introduced to the chemical matrix. It forces the atomic structure to crystallize. It is a mandatory structural engineering requirement. The secondary failure is phase separation. After sustained cycles of thermal destabilization and structural refreezing, the compound stratifies. The chemical components isolate. They fail to recombine symmetrically. This microscopic separation degrades the absolute thermal capacity. Historical operators of these systems recorded this exact mechanical decay. The matrices required physical intervention to maintain optimal function. It is not an autonomous system. The tertiary failure is fundamental physics. You already possess this data. The sodium matrix dictates stabilization. It is not mechanical refrigeration. It locks the localized climate at the phase change threshold. But once the physical mass transitions to total liquid, the capacity is exhausted. It is saturated. It cannot absorb a single additional joule until it solidifies. In a geographic zone with infinite thermal load and 0 nocturnal drop, the matrix cannot reset. The structural defense collapses. Finally, the chemical must be physically encapsulated. It requires localized containment. It demands precise thermal tuning for regional climate data. Exposed sodium powder is functionally useless. None of these mechanical failures are terminal. Every failure possesses a documented engineering correction. But these physical variables do not explain the total erasure of the technology. To comprehend the architectural vanishing, you must analyze the flow of centralized capital. Analyze the economic threat of the sodium structure. Centralized energy utilities and mechanical refrigeration conglomerates dictate global markets. Their economic survival demands a singular, unbreakable sequence. You must purchase kinetic suppression. You must purchase the electrical current to maintain it. In perpetuity, a biological structure that stabilizes its own thermal load breaks this metric. It terminates the sale of the compressor. It severs the electrical demand. A localized barrier that absorbs thermodynamic radiation autonomously is not an engineering oddity. It is the physical destruction of a recurring financial sequence. Observe standard planetary construction protocols. Structural conglomerates maximize capital by prioritizing rapid assembly. They utilize low-mass timber frames. They utilize hollow geometric cavities. They install lightweight synthetic materials. This architecture is rapidly deployed. It minimizes capital expenditure, but it is thermodynamically defenseless. It cannot resist ambient heat flux. It requires a bolted-on mechanical compressor to prevent biological failure. The low-mass structure and the centralized compressor operate as a symbiotic financial system. One manufactures the thermal vulnerability. The other monetizes the suppression. Capital flows through both vectors. This is the critical data point. During the structural testing of the 1970s and 1980s, the sodium phase technology exhibited physical hurdles. A civilization incentivized to deploy autonomous thermal stabilization would have diverted massive capital to engineer solutions. We routinely conquer severe physical variables. Instead, the architectural sector dismissed the sodium matrix. They labeled the physics unstable. They allowed the technology to vanish. The centralized compressor became the absolute structural mandate. The entities drafting municipal zoning codes were heavily integrated with the entities manufacturing the compressors. They were never going to embed autonomous thermodynamic suppression in your walls. They profit exclusively from the vulnerability. If the industrial complex refuses the installation, the protocol is absolute. You execute the physics yourself. This is the exact configuration of a localized phase change matrix. This is why a single biological operator can construct it without municipal authorization. Secure the chemical payload. The baseline requirement is sodium sulfate decahydrate. It is globally abundant. Untreated, it destabilizes at exactly 32 degrees Celsius. This threshold exceeds optimal human parameters. The physical correction requires chemical blending. You introduce a specific ratio of sodium chloride. The standard table variant. This structural contamination forces the melting point down to 25 degrees Celsius. This chemical tuning locks the phase transition to the exact biological requirement. If you refuse chemical manipulation, you can acquire factory-sealed phase change geometries. The capital acquisition cost is higher. The mechanical failures are largely pre-solved. Next is the encapsulation phase. This is an absolute structural mandate. The compound requires zero atmospheric exposure. The verified protocol from the North Carolina installation is primitive. Seal the chemical mass inside rigid polyvinyl chloride cylinders. Align the cylinders in parallel arrays. Utilize a kinetic fan to force ambient oxygen across the surface area. Flexible synthetic pouches or flat geometries are also valid. The physical shape is irrelevant. The absolute encapsulation is mandatory. The matrix transitions to a fluid state during every solar cycle. To counteract the supercooling anomaly, inject the nucleating seed into the matrix prior to sealing. It guarantees structural crystallization. It forces the nocturnal reset. Mount the sealed geometries at maximum thermal exposure against an interior surface receiving direct solar radiation, or suspended in the upper structural cavity. Deploy the fan to kineticize the oxygen. During the solar peak, the matrix consumes the thermal load. It holds the baseline static. During the nocturnal drop, the atomic lattice solidifies. It ejects the radiation. Minor atmospheric ventilation purges the heat from the structure. The matrix is reset. The parameters dictate reality. This requires absolute precision. The chemical tuning, the nucleating injection, the absolute encapsulation seal, they demand exact tolerances. But the basal components require minimal capital. They are biologically inert. They are non-combustibly. This is a severe statistical anomaly for unauthorized structural modifications. Post-installation, the physical outcome is entirely dependent on geographic coordinates. The matrix is a specific tool. It integrates seamlessly with specific biomes. It structurally fails in others. The sodium matrix is optimized for the exact zones where standard thermal mass dominates. Climates exhibiting massive thermal amplitude, extreme solar peaks, severe nocturnal drops. The nocturnal drop is non-negotiable. It is the physical catalyst for the atomic reassembly. Provide the atmospheric drop. The sodium barrier will suppress the thermal peak of the afternoon cycle. Perpetually, it is optimized for high-exposure zones, elevated architectural levels, solar-facing rooms, industrial retrofits where massive concrete installation is physically impossible. Integrate the matrix with nocturnal ventilation. The physical systems amplify each other. It will not survive in static, high-temperature, high-humidity biomes. If the nocturnal drop never occurs, the matrix never solidifies. The defense is broken. It requires periodic physical intervention. Align the physics with the environment. The result is absolute control. Deploy it outside its thermal parameters. The failure is mathematically guaranteed. Analyze the total sequence. This technology was not abandoned by physics. The thermodynamic equations are absolute. The chemical precursors are virtually free. The physical arrays function perfectly. The federal energy apparatus is analyzing it immediately. It was abandoned by capital. It was erased from municipal architecture, not due to mechanical failure, but because the entities supplying centralized suppression have zero financial incentive to render their machines obsolete. The planetary tilt guarantees the seasonal thermal load. That is orbital mechanics. The sodium compound was always present, an inexpensive, biologically safe crystal structure, capable of consuming massive kinetic energy, capable of holding a physical space entirely static, without drawing a single watt. The only variable that shifted was the corporate entity profiting from your enforced reliance on mechanical suppression. If you require further physical data, if you wish to sever your reliance on centralized utilities and recurring capital extraction, initiate the subscription protocol. This archive executes thermal suppression through undisputed physics. The complete manual remains indexed in the description below. Finally, the algorithmic sequencing has determined the next optimal visual input for your parameters. Initiate the playback sequence.